Welcome back to Say Nothing, the podcast bringing you an exclusive serialization of this gripping audiobook. Whether you're tuning in for the first time or following along chapter by chapter, settle in, get comfortable, and enjoy the ride. If you can't wait for the next episode, or you'd like to experience Say Nothing in full, you can purchase the complete book right now. Just follow the link in the description. Chapter 3. Looking skywards, there were no clouds to be seen. The full moon cast sharp, long shadows on the street below, while the summer air was still and serene. It had passed 2 o'clock in the morning, yet the man in the short, dark coat felt no inclination to head home. He walked, head bowed, through the market quarter, hands firmly in his pockets. It was as if he expected confrontation. 22 and a proud son of the city, Peter James would be the first to admit his beliefs were those of his father. Yet it was this same code of ethics and steadfast refusal to compromise that had led him to walking alone through the streets in the middle of this August night, waiting to feel the hand of others on his person. He could hear his father's voice inside, offering words of encouragement and support. The choices we make define us. These were the words Peter lived by, and the code he hoped to pass down to the next generation. He would never get that chance. Where he was and what had happened, he did not know. The last thing he remembered was passing the waterfront precinct and hearing a struggling diesel engine approaching. After that, there was nothing but confusion and darkness. There had been no struggle, no questions asked, simply a black hood thrust over his head. Now he was awake and trapped. The choices we make define us. He repeated it over and again as he sat in silence. As long as he stood by this mantra, he knew he would be okay. The silence in the room was betrayed by the quiet breathing of another. Say nothing, Pete told himself. At this point, integrity was everything. I will not break. He played over in his mind how he had come to be in this position, his rights as a human being. No matter what he'd done, seen, heard, or planned, he could rely on due process. The extent of this naivety would soon reveal that, when it comes to breaking point, some people won't even stop once they hear the snap. It was the dryness of his mouth that woke him. Exasperated and incapacitated in equal measure, he mustered the energy to claw his hand to the side. The glass was still cold, but its contents empty. It felt as though he was choking on sand, the sensation of suffocation exacerbated by the inability to think coherently and impairing his vision. Though the pain was transient, in this one moment he felt like his world was collapsing. Out of the darkness he heard a comforting sound. Here, drink this. It was cold, wet, and fulfilling. An angel had come to deliver salvation, and he felt nothing but shame. I'm sorry about last night, Owen uttered, his voice hoarse from the alcohol-induced dehydration. I'll call them later and apologize. Don't know what came over me. Sarah sighed, struggled to her feet, and in a moment of vengeance, ripped apart the curtains. Her husband howled in anguish and rolled onto his face, his voice muffled, his tone conciliatory. Okay, I guess I deserved that. Yep, now get up. We've got things to do. He howled a second time, but knew sympathy was in short supply. Rolling out of bed, he grabbed his jeans from the floor and pulled on a t-shirt and sweater. Whatever she had planned for the day would have to be tackled through a splitting headache. He headed downstairs and wandered into the kitchen, battling a yawn that served only to inflict yet more pain. Here he is. Had a bit of a late one, did we? The sound of the voice jolted Owen to the core. A cold chill ran down his spine and his senses were on edge. Adrenaline began to course through his body. It had been years since he'd been face to face with his visitor, And now, here he was, sitting in the kitchen with his pregnant wife. There was only one way he could play the situation: keep cool and get things over with as quickly as possible. "Tom," he said with an unnatural level of enthusiasm, how on earth did you find us here? It's been how long?" "A long fucking time, that's how long," replied the dark-haired visitor. The thick Ulster accent was the first Owen had heard since they had moved to Paris. "Good to see you looking so well, boy." He turned to Sarah. "We go back a long time, your man and me. Well, him, Pete, and me." He cast a wink to Owen. "Oh, really?" Sarah said with intrigue. "Best put some fresh coffee on then. Tom, can I get you another?" He motioned to her to stay seated. "Not for me. Thought I'd take your man out for a little while. Get him to show me around. What do you say, boy?" As reluctant as he was to spend any time with Tom, taking matters away from his family was music to his ears. "Yeah, course. Let me just grab my jacket and we'll get out of here." Tom got to his feet and went to kiss Sarah's hand. The gesture was insincere and awkward. "Lovely to meet you. Can't wait to see the little fella, too," he said, pointing to her stomach. She replied the polite, gracious smile she had perfected since moving to a country where the language was alien. Owen leant down and kissed her on the cheek. He whispered ever so slightly into her ear, "I'm sorry." As the two men left the room, Sarah was overcome with unease and fear. She'd never once heard Owen mention anyone by the name of Tom. That Owen was clearly rattled didn't augur well. Never before had she seen him transform into such a shell of a man, and the instant nature of the switch was enough to make her fear for both his safety and that of her unborn child. Though the early morning rain was drying underfoot, the gray sky above set the tone for the day ahead. There would be darkness descending on the city over the course of the next few hours. As soon as they were away from the house, the stony silence between the two men was finally broken. "What are you doing here, Tom?" "What do you mean? Came to see you, didn't I?" "And what possible reason could you have to come to see me? How did you even find out where we were?" The agitation in his voice was clear and growing. Tom stopped dead. With a menace in his tone and a wide-eyed look boring directly into Owen's skull, he replied, "I'm here because of Pete." Owen took a deep inhalation of breath. "And you seem to forget that anyone can be found if you put your mind to it. Surely you know that better than anyone? And surely you know that Pete's dead." Owen was taken aback by how confrontational he sounded. Startled, he resumed walking, the piercing stare of Tom's eyes upon him. He made the choice to diffuse the situation and pointed to his left. "Down here. We'll get a drink." The two men from Northern Ireland took a seat in the traditional Parisian cafe. It was warm, and the aroma was that of freshly baked pastries and secondhand smoke, a scene reminiscent of a 1920s postcard. There were few other patrons dotted around the room, but enough to know that, should the situation turn bad, there would be no scene. In the few minutes it had taken them to re-engage in conversation, Owen had played through a number of scenarios, deciding how to play the situation to the best of his benefit. There was only one thing for it, and it was to get Tom on board. It wouldn't be easy, particularly after everything Tom had experienced in the intervening years, but he had the nous and experience that could prove invaluable. Ordering 2 coffees and a glass of water, the results of the previous evening were beginning to return. He looked across at Tom and braced himself for what was coming next. But before he could say a word, his companion reached into his jacket and placed an unopened letter onto the table. "As I was saying," he said with menace, "I'm here because of Pete." Owen looked down at the envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable, and the discoloration of the paper indicated that it had been in Tom's possession for some time. He struggled to string any words together, instead sitting in a state of bemusement. As much as he wanted to tear the envelope open and absorb the contents, he was overcome with terror. What if everything had been a lie? He'd spent the last decade compiling evidence and planning for the eventual outcome. His brother was to be the figurehead, the catalyst of something great. What if he was to fall so close to conquering the final hurdle? From across the table, Tom could see Owen was incapable of moving. "Open the fucking letter, would you?" he barked. There was a time he remembered when he was just 10 years old. It was late Sunday evening, and following his routine of bath and tea in front of the television, he was readied for bed. His mom, dad, and the baby brother he'd so longed for were together in the front room when the knock at the door came. Two plain-clothed police officers stood on the doorstep and asked his father to accompany them to the station. He recalled precisely what his father had said to him before he went out the door. "Get yourself to bed and ready for school tomorrow. Everything will be okay. I'll see you soon." As the duo escorted him from the house, his innocence went with it. Staring out the window, he saw his father climb into the back of the car. From the kitchen, he could hear his mother stifling her own weeping by singing softly to her 3-month-old baby. The memory of this evening had come flooding back as he remained hooded. When his father finally returned, 6 days later in the middle of the night, he wasn't the man that had left. What he'd experienced had changed him. In the kneeled position that he'd been sat for the past few hours, he felt an affinity with his father like never before. They had never spoken about the temporary incarceration he'd experienced, but somehow Pete knew that he was experiencing the same ordeal. He wanted to remember the father he had in the years before that Sunday night. He needed to remember the person he was before tonight. A smattering of rain had returned to the center of Paris. From the window seat in the cafe, Owen could see Parisians suddenly rushing through their day-to-day lives. He was conscious of Tom's talking, but took in nothing that was said. It was futile to even pretend to listen. After reading the contents of the letter, his mind could focus on nothing else. It confirmed that which he already knew. The horrors his sibling had experienced, the shame he felt, the distrust he had. The age gap between the two brothers was enough for Owen to have been ignorant of his struggles. But in the past few years, particularly in the past few weeks, he had been feeling closer than ever to Pete. There were similarities in his personality, a shared belief in right and wrong, and an inherent determination to fight back. Where he had fleeting moments of uncertainty over his decisions to act, he was now certain, beyond anything else, that a statement needed to be made. Of course, the age gap also meant that, as soon as Owen was old enough to properly interact, Pete had his own circle of friends, including Tom, and was busy trying to conquer the opposite sex. Even still, the 10-year difference meant he idolized his older brother even more. His mother often reminded him of the time, aged 6, he tried to style his hair and dress like Pete. No matter how often he heard the story, he always noted the sparkle in her eyes as she retold it. It was clear this was one of the fondest memories of their time together in Belfast. With the events that surrounded the period, it was no surprise that she clung to the littlest detail and tried to preserve these special moments. But there is no memory that is infallible. He knew that memories of Pete were clouded by nostalgia. The fact is, Aside from sharing an address, the two were complete strangers. It wasn't the fault of the two brothers, nor was it a failing of the upbringing they experienced. It was just circumstance that they were born a decade apart. If they had grown older together, the bond would have been unbreakable. Owen was deprived of that opportunity, and it was against this he had railed for so long. The day of reprisal was approaching fast. "When did you get this?" Owen's tone demanded an answer. "I came across it clearing out some boxes when moving. It must have been with the others, but got forgotten while I was inside. Thought I'd track you down and find a means to get here. Where there's a will, there's a way." "Now you're getting it," he quipped. "So here it is. What does it say?" "A lot. A lot of what I already knew, and a lot I needed to know." He emptied his cup and pulled on his jacket. Throwing the money down onto the table, he picked up the message from his dead brother and slipped it into his coat pocket. "Look, I've got to head off. You sticking around long?" "Nah, I got my own things to do. Catching up on time, if you know what I mean. Got a flight back to Belfast this evening. Listen, Owen, you know I'd have done anything for Pete. Shit, I've done a lot more for people I don't give a crap about. I'm just sorry about it all. I should have done more." Owen noted the contrite tone. "Nothing you could have done. Pete got fucked for all of us. Now it's our turn." Tom had seen the look in Owen's eyes before, a look common among his former inmates, unbridled rage. "I'm sorry for earlier," he said, attempting to quell the anger he could see rising. "Your girl looks fine, though. Good luck." With that, the potential for a tumultuous encounter was over. Tom walked into the Paris rain, and Owen turned to head home. He needed to take stock of what he'd read. Get it all down so that tomorrow he could judge with a clearer mind. The last thing he wanted was to rush the situation and make simple mistakes. Get home and get clear. Leave the rest for later. Thank you for listening to this excerpt from Say Nothing, a compelling thriller currently available on Amazon. Follow the link in the description to order your copy today. Please like and review this podcast and recommend to your friends. Don't forget to tune in again and join us for the next chapter.